and welcome to Cold War Conversations live stream, talking to Jon Benjamin, who is the British ambassador to Chile, and he had a chance to speak with Margot Honecker, the wife of Erich Honecker, the penultimate, well, not the penultimate leader of East Germany, because you've probably got, is it Lothar de Maizière, who was the last leader of East Germany. Anyway, I get into too much detail. So it's your opportunity to ask questions of Jon. How many times, Jon, were you speaking with Margot, and over sort of what sort of length?
Yeah, so there were three substantial meetings, one of which was dinner in a house, which was a kind of strange honor of sorts, because as we discussed last time, as I said in my written article on the subject, she was living a bit of a hermit's life, and very, very few people had ever been invited to her house. In fact, her daughter's house, um, outside a tiny clique of communist sympathizers, including Chileans who'd lived in East Germany when they fled from Pinochet after the coup against Allende. So two conversations at my house, which was the British Embassy residence, one long dinner. I guess you're talking 7 to 8 hours in total. She also put in an appearance at my farewell kind of party as ambassador there, but uh, obviously, if you everyone who's ever hosted a party knows you end up almost talking to nobody, um, rather than 3 words to everybody. So three substantive occasions.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the your farewell party, she had a rather interesting encounter with somebody who you wouldn't expect her to have a chat
Yeah,
with.
so she ran into, uh, partly because I engineered it out of a sense of mischievousness, but um, the daughter of Pinochet, who was there because she was a local councillor for the borough of or municipality of Santiago, where the embassy and the residents were. So it was legitimate that she should be there. But I think they both probably had a significant double take on being introduced to each other.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, so I can see we've got some people joining. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat. I'd love to share them with Jon. I've got some questions of my own, Jon. I mean, she's been given various descriptions by by people, and you know could you just give, sort of what sort of insight you saw into her personality, and maybe how possibly her formative years had shaped her, let's say, worldview?
Mm. So two things there really in her personality. I mean, as you'll have seen in the written article, on the face of it, in the context when I met her when she was already mid 80s, and as it turned out, what 4 or 5 years before the end of her life, she, as my Chilean wife commented on meeting her, she just seemed like a little sweet, innocent old lady on the face of it, visually. Um, of course, they couldn't really communicate because Margot Honecker spoke no Spanish, even after, don't forget, she'd already been there 20 years when I met her, but she could barely, say hello and goodbye. And she didn't have any English. Um, so my wife couldn't communicate with her. So that was very impressionistic, but that's how she seemed. However, in conversation, she's very, very steely, very unforgiving. You'll see, we discussed previously, and I, in the account that I wrote, I said that, when I said that I'd heard gunfire one night when I was living in East Berlin, and it turned out to be someone being, I never quite discovered, shot at or shot at the wall. She just shrugged. There was no uh, human sympathy there, or she didn't seem particularly bothered. And I think to be at the top of the power structure in East Germany and making the decisions that she and her husband and Erich Mielke and people like that made, you must have been really hard to in your soul to do that in the first place, and then to have been hardened further by, in her case, what, 30 years effectively, nearly 28 years at the top. So that's a very long time. So she didn't really give an inch on anything or suggest any great human sympathy for the victims of the system in the GDR. So I think she was, underneath it, she was a very hard person, and also not a hint of regret or even reconsideration of her worldviews in the light of what had happened, and visceral hatred of Gorbachev, which we've discussed before, for ruining the system that brought him up and that he inherited. So quite hard-hearted, I think, and self-certain, sure of the ideology that had governed her adult life, and certain, despite its complete and utter defeat in 1989, that it would be back.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a definite feel that she was on the right side of history, I guess. We got a question from Jack Weslek. And his question is, were there any other people present when you interviewed her, and how was their demeanor?
Yeah.
So I guess he's talking about people who were friends or associates of Margot.
Hello, Jack. Thanks for the question. To my surprise, the first meeting where we finally got her to speak, and I think you may have seen in the article I wrote that it took at least a year of negotiations with people in the Chilean Communist Party. It's almost like a crocodile reflex, say Chinese Communist Party these days. It comes up in so many conversations, but in the Chilean Communist Party. So it took a long time. But because of that, to my surprise, she turned up completely on her own to the first meeting. In fact, she asked us to send the embassy car to pick her up, which we did, obviously. And she came on her own. And in the first and the third conversation, it was me and her, with my wife saying hello, perhaps a couple of the resident staff wandering in and out to offer a coffee or something to eat. And then, of course, the second meeting was with her daughter, Sonia, and her grandson, and a couple of Chilean associates in her house. And then the third meeting was, again, one-on-one. So that was somewhat to my surprise, to be honest. But she didn't have a traveling entourage, no.
Right. Right. And I've got another question from one of our financial supporters. And unfortunately, I didn't note down their name, so my sincere apologies for that. He's asking, were reports or debriefs required after these visits as far as the British government was concerned? And also, was the German government interested at all in these meetings?
Well, that's a great question. The answer is pretty much the reverse. If you have a look at the article I wrote, you'll see that when we finally did meet in that first conversation, she did ask me several times why it was the British government were interested. And the whole truth of the matter is that they weren't. Nobody put me up to this. I did it off my own back, outside my day job, because I had a fascination with the GDR. I'd lived there briefly, been there on a university exchange, was fascinated by the study of Marxist systems and communist systems, particularly in Eastern Europe. And it was pretty much totally for my own edification. I did write a couple of reports afterwards, and I I sent them to our then ambassador in Germany. I sent them to the Germany desk and a couple of researchers in the Foreign Office. But it was kind of like, and I think it actually, as I recall, a copy was shown to William Hague, but only because he was kind of interested in the subject too, not because of any policy um, consequences from it. So I did report back a bit, but if I hadn't done so, nobody would have asked me. And it was motivated by my own uh, fascination, which continues to this day. Hence me looking enviously at Ian's book collection over the back, over his shoulder there, seeing the letters DDR and various others. So it was really out of personal interest. And I didn't ask permission. My attitude generally is ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And I didn't see any particular risks in doing this because historical nicety, as opposed to, as concerns the German government, I don't think, though I don't know, that our ambassador in Germany gave a copy of my account to anyone there. He may have done. I mentioned to the German ambassador in Chile that I'd met her, and he was quite fascinated and told her a bit about what had happened. Interestingly, in my next posting, Ian, which was in Ghana, where I was High Commissioner, which is the same as ambassador, it's exactly the same obscure anachronistic reasons why it's called differently in Commonwealth countries. But the German ambassador in Ghana at the time, now retired, was one of the tiny handful of professional diplomats from the East German Foreign Ministry who were kept on in after unification in the West German and then the United German Auswärtiges Amt in the Foreign Service. So I told him, and he was years later, he was fascinated to hear it. But no, it was overwhelmingly a personal initiative, born out of personal experience and fascination.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'd be fascinated to interview a former East German diplomat and hear their story from the other side of the fence. But
Well,
yeah,
the first thing is how many are left who acquired anything like a reasonably senior position. I was in Indonesia in 1989, late 89, when the GDR suddenly, the wall opened and the GDR effectively collapsed, even if its death was prolonged for what, another almost a year. And I remember two young-ish East German diplomats I used to talk to slightly guardedly. I'm sure one at least was a Stasi resident. And I remember their demeanor and how downcast they were when the news came through. But they obviously they'd be my age now, early 60s, as I was, mid to late 20s then. So, but senior ones, even you can look up the names of kind of the Stasi officers in London, in Washington. You can pretty much figure out. I think we know who they were. I'm not sure how many of them are around. Very few, I would have thought.
yeah, yeah. Were they normally the cultural attaché? Was that the giveaway tag, or were they a little bit more
No,
obscure?
that's a bit of a myth. It was never really quite like that. They were all just officers in the political section. They might have been the economic commercial officer, and various guises. And in the East German embassy in Indonesia, when I served there, there were maybe 4 or 5 of them. So presumably 2 or 3 of them were Stasi. Marcus Wolf's foreign intelligence outfit.
Yeah, yeah. Jack Wesolak has asked a further question. I should just give you a bit of background about Jack. Jack was is a former citizen of the GDR. He escaped. I think it was in the 1980s. We did an episode on that. And his question is, I enjoyed the East German school system, enjoyed in inverted commas. Did you have any conversations about her role decisions that affected about 16 million people directly?
Yeah. Um, Yes. So a couple of things stand out. One was her absolute clarity that children needed to be taught Marxism and the evils of capitalism and imperialism from an early age. And in my impression, a view I continue to hold, knowing some modern day Marxists here in the UK, is that it is a quasi religion, right? It has its prophet and its book, and the dogma revealed in the book is the whole truth, with the entire keys to the whole of human organization and societal legal justifications for running a political system. And children needed to be brought up in that from a very, very early age. He was quite clear about that. And I asked her about, you'll be aware of the stories of youth, what would you call them, re-education centers maybe for recidivist youth, either politically or just kids, adolescents being, behaving badly, as happens everywhere. And she said that was for their own good if they needed to. And she said every other country has a remedial system for the worst behaving and worst performing children to be taken out normal schooling and treated separately. I asked her about the accusations that she had in her role as education minister actively arranged the kind of resettlement within East Germany, or the adoption within East Germany of children of dissidents, either imprisoned or sold off to West Germany, or usually both, right? They were usually imprisoned for a lengthy period and then just shoved out of the country and their citizenship taken away in return for the money that the lawyer Vogel famously brought in on a frequent basis. And she blamed the dissidents for abandoning their children through their reckless actions, and that the Republic had looked after their own, so taking care of those children and not punished them for the sins of their parents. Again, all of these answers you'll see is very much in the context of what I said earlier, and about completely unforgiving and unrepentant, and on the face of it, with no doubts at all about the correctness of all the actions that she took.
Yeah. Yeah. We've also got Mark Brain who's joined us, who's another ex guest. Now, he was with Reuters and the BBC in Berlin, and he was under quite heavy surveillance from the Stasi. But he's curious as to what Margot, he's corrected my pronunciation, which he always does. Thank you, Mark, for that. What she thought of November the 9th and the Schabowski infamous press conference. Did you discuss that with her?
Briefly, Mark, I mean, whenever I went down that territory, it pretty much always came back to it was all Gorbachev's fault. So what happened on the 9th of November and the hurried, unplanned reading out of the new travel authority before it was supposed to be read out, before they were ready, because I think the idea was that police stations all over East Germany would be set up to issue exit visas in a controlled sort of way over time. I think my impression was that, like everybody else, that was just messy humanity. It was a screw up. There was no conspiracy. It was just a mess up in the stressed out, period. My impression personally now is that Egon Krenz and who was it who read it out? Shabowski. Yeah, that they'd had a very hurried conversation, and therefore, obviously, as kind of spokesman for the government, he hadn't prepared himself properly and was put on the spot and came out with that answer. But she would very much just see that as a milestone along the unraveling that was deliberately set in train by Gorbachev, who should have defended the Politburo and the East German system. And I think her view was also, where we mentioned the Politburo, she was quite clear that perhaps taking their orders from Moscow, they'd been incredibly disloyal to her husband, who'd raised most of them up into the Politburo. One or two, like Erich Honecker, I think had been with him from the get-go, right? But most of them had joined the Politburo during his time. Just like when a pope dies, most of the cardinals have been put in place in the lifetime of that pope, right? It's not a wholly dissimilar type of concept. So she was, there was a lot, whether it was about Gorbachev or other East German figures who she felt had let down her husband, there was a lot about loyalty and discipline that was lacking, or that was basically undermined. A lot of treachery, treason, a lot of that sort of talk.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Mark's further commented now as it's almost like Russian TV today. They hate Gorbachev or Gorbachev. Yeah, a similarity there. I mean, I'm interested to know how much she talked about her husband, because the impression I got is towards the end of the 1980s they were pretty much estranged, and how that relationship might have changed when they were both exiled together.
Yeah. Of course, like you, I don't know at first hand, but I've read a lot of the literature you see now about various affairs, including rumors about her, not just about him. But he, grey and faceless and lacking in obvious charisma, and with his shrill voice as he was quite a ladies' man by all accounts. Quite apart from his 3 marriages, right? So she was number 3. And of course, he ditched the much older number 1 wife because he started having an affair in the very early days of the GDR with his later second wife. But she didn't give anything away on that. She certainly played the dutiful, loyal wife, that she'd been his prime supporter, and I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in their luxury house in Bandlitz. Luxury by then GDR standards, by all accounts, it wasn't actually that luxurious. If you've ever watched any of the documentaries made afterwards. I think when he arrived in Chile, from the moment he arrived until when he died, I think was something like 15, 16 months. It wasn't much more than that. And I do recall her, I don't know if she said it or intimated, but it was obvious when he arrived that he didn't have that long left. And in fact, I got the impression that he lived longer than expected. And indeed, he was released from Germany at that time and allowed to travel, partly on the basis that doctors had said that he didn't have that long left. So perhaps he lasted longer. And they spent an awful lot of time together. I think she helped him with writing some of his memoirs. I think by the time he arrived in Chile, perhaps this was a condition put on him by put on both of them by the Chilean government. They didn't do much more media during that time. So she certainly painted herself as the loyal, supportive wife and ideological soulmate of Erich Honecker.
Yeah. Yeah. Did she talk much about when he was held in prison in Berlin? Because he was held, I can't remember the name of the prison he was held in. But it was quite a
Was it
famous.
Moabit? Moabit?
Yes, I think you're
Yeah.
right. I th
Yeah. I think yeah, she didn't talk about, as I recall, anything about life in the prison. She, again, this theme of treachery that kept coming through. She said that West Germany and East Germany were completely separate countries, obviously, and that after a long journey, East Germany got West Germany to recognize it as such. And therefore, it was wholly wrong that East Germans had been put on trial for acts in East Germany while it was a separate country and recognized as such, under the laws effectively of West Germany, which were carried over into United Germany. So for her, and I think for him, and I think this was part of the defense of all of them, including Marcus Wolf and Erich Mielke, and the relatively few who were ever seriously put on trial, was that, quite apart from the substance, the judicial basis for putting them on trial in United Germany was to them morally and judicially bankrupt. And she did say that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, just want to mention to our viewers, you can ask questions in the chat on the right-hand side of the live stream that you're watching. John and I would welcome any further questions. And I mean, one of the um, areas that fascinates me about the story of the Honeckers is when they lose power. They stay for some time at the house of a pastor who
Mm,
puts them up, and I think there's been a drama
yeah.
film made about that. Did she talk anything about that experience or how that
I
was for her?
Yeah, I don't recall her talking about the pastor. Neither did I ask her. I wish I'd had you in the room with me, Ian, to
Yeah.
supply me with all these pertinent questions
Oh,
that,
so do
that
I.
I
So do
failed to ask
I.
13 years ago. But she did make clear that, perhaps an experience many of us have in our lives at different points, that when power and position and status were removed, that a lot of people she thought of as friends and close associates kind of melted away like the snow in spring, um, and that there were very few people who stood by her. I mean, she certainly appreciated when she got to Chile the support of these very few figures who'd lived in the GDR and were associated with the Chilean Communist Party, and so she didn't talk about that specifically, but they obviously had very few people they could rely on. I mean, don't forget that Erich Honecker walked in one morning in the middle of a crisis. Although by all accounts he didn't ever appreciate the full gravity of it, and sat down, and one of the other Politburo members interrupted the meeting and said, "Point of order. We're going to take a vote on whether the general secretary should be removed," and he was. And in good communist fashion, he voted for it, to ensure Politburo unanimity, and he was out and invited to leave. So it was very sudden, and it was what really only days after Gorbachev had been there for the 40th anniversary, right? I think what, 10 days after, was it even that? A few days after that.
Yeah, it
So
wasn't long.
the sense, again, I apologize for keep coming back to the main overriding theme, but it was very visceral, and that was the sense of betrayal,
Mm.
by so many people.
Yeah. Yeah, I found a great photo which I posted on social media, I think a couple of weeks back, of the pair of them. And I think it may have been in the pastor's house. And it's a
Mm,
black and white photo, and they just look like somebody's grandparents. I mean, as
yeah,
as as you say, they just look so ordinary. And when that whole veneer of power
yeah,
disappears, they are just ordinary, albeit with a horrendous
yeah.
history behind them.
I mean, look, having been until the end of last year in the civil service, the British diplomatic service for 40 years, and come across many elected leaders in our system, I can tell you that applies very widely to an awful lot of people um, who hold power at some point. And of course, if you're in unquestioned power for nearly 3 decades, that sense of loss. I mean, in our system, if you're a politician, I mean, you kind of you know, at the very top, if you look at say Thatcher and then Blair as the prime examples, even there, 11 years is your tops, and in all likelihood, it's less than that. And our politicians, like say Rishi Sunak last year, he could read the polls as you and I and people watching in could, and you kind of know what's coming. But when you've had that unquestioned power for so long and then don't see the end coming, the sense of loss and stupefaction at suddenly being cut loose from all that and the privilege must be unfathomable. And if you're already in your late 70s, well, how old were they? Yeah, late 70s at that point. It must have been on a human psychological level impossible to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I'm always intrigued as to what the hardliners did when the whole nation imploded. You know, what did they completely do a turnaround in their beliefs and become? I've always thought the Stasi would probably be really good salespeople because they've got
Mm.
that familiarity with the way the mind works and successful techniques in terms of getting information out of people. Now we've got a few more questions come in. Mark Brain is asking, do you have friends in the old East, John, 50 years on? Some of our closest friends go back to those special days of youth, says Mark.
Yeah, I do one or two, although I kind of had more friends in West Berlin. When I was in East Berlin on a university exchange, we were pretty closely watched and marshaled around. Although we went out to bars, and I mean, I was in my early 20s or 20. I was literally 20, 21 at that point. So we did lots of that. But um, of the friends I have left in Germany from those days, more were then West Berliners. Because, of course, even the East Berlin students we interacted with were quite hesitant about being seen to talk to us too much and spend too much time with us. Um, and on your question about what a lot of them did afterwards, I think it goes back. I mean, Margot Honecker wasn't Margot and wasn't alone in being a true believer to the end and beyond the end. And of course, many found a place in PDS and then PDS and then Die Linke if they were around for long enough. Others made a spectacular conversion into arch capitalists and made a lot of money, or started traveling extensively in the very parts of the world that were previously forbidden to them. And of course, they all got a pension from the United German government. And I commented to you before, Ian, that Margot Honecker was very unhappy about her husband being tried by what she regarded still as West Germany. But she didn't seem to have any objection to her receiving €1,000 a month. And that was then, that was 13, 14 years ago, in a pension, which went a very long way in Chile in 2012. She didn't seem to have any problem with that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So a question from John: was the fear of the Honeckers that a Romania situation would erupt in East Germany, or were they more obsessant to the Soviet Union so that it could never occur? So I guess were more always looking to the Soviet Union for guidance. I guess towards the end of East Germany, they realized, I guess almost in the same way that we think Trump is potentially not an ally, that, all bets were off with the Soviet Union and they were essentially on their own.
Yeah, well, a couple of things to unpack that one, John, and for John. I think that, and I'm aware there are people on this call who are much more expert than I am, so I'm just giving my best guess on some of these things. Of course, the answer on the Soviet Union was yes for most of it, but of course, by the end, again, it keeps going back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev said famously in East Berlin that people who arrive too late are on the wrong side of history. For me, a question is, some weeks after his fall, just before the wall opened, we're talking a month, really, aren't we? In between, something like that. If Honecker had still been in charge at that crucial moment in Leipzig, say, would he have issued instructions to open fire? Because he, for all that there was a Politburo collective decision-making system in theory, it was one-man rule for a long time, effectively on the ultimate key decisions. They were his call, coordinated with Moscow. And I think it's more likely that they would have made the call to use force if Honecker had still been there. I mean, Honecker saw what happened in way back in 1953 in East Berlin, and then 56 in Bucharest, 68 in Prague, early 80s in Poland. He described solidarity as a counter-revolutionary movement, as did Arthur Scargill, incidentally, of blessed memory, and genuinely believed that the people behind the protests would have been kind of Western imperialist agents and people trying to bring the system down. My guess is Erich Honecker still in charge, we would have seen a more violent outcome. I mean, I think Ceausescu was much more of a kind of megalomaniac, idiosyncratic, one-person rule, with the ideology shaped much more to his personal preferences rather than the other way around.
Yeah, yeah. So if anybody's got any questions to ask, please post them in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. I can see some other questions coming through there, so I will get to them in a moment. A question from Mark Thompson is, did she mention any fellow Germans who escaped to Chile post-war?
No. You mean East Germans who went back to Chile?
I think because he said post-war, I'm thinking is not any Nazis that fled to Chile, but also any. Let's talk about East Germans that had potentially fled to Chile.
Well, there was one because Nazis who escaped to South America went more to Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia. Chile, up to then and beyond, was quite difficult to get to. It's far away and it's across the Andes mountain range. The one famous one was Walter Rauff, who, amongst other things, invented the mobile gas chamber at the start of the Holocaust. And Pinochet refused to extradite him back to Germany or to Israel or anywhere else. And he died a natural death in Chile. He was the most famous. There was no one else in that league, and there were very few. I think of Chileans who went to East Germany, of course, they went back a bit before this happened, when Pinochet started loosening the system as they headed towards the restoration of democracy. Although, ironically, the end of Pinochet and the end of East Germany ended up being pretty much the same time. And quite a lot of Allende, about 2,000 Chileans ended up in East Germany, most famously including Michelle Bachelet, who was much later was twice president, first ever woman president of Chile, and then she was re-elected some years later, who'd spent some time there. Quite a few of the Pinochet the Allende henchmen who went to East Germany couldn't stand it and left and went to Paris and other places. And Roberto Ampuero, who was briefly foreign minister for Piñera, the right of center president, a few years ago, his experiences in East Germany turned him from Marxism into quite right of center libertarianism, and he ditched the ideology, having seen what it meant in real existing socialism, as the system was called. So and I spoke to a few of those people, but of course I've got a great book which is in German about the East German diplomats in Chile when the coup happened, which they were as unprepared for as Allende himself. And they stayed for some time, even as relations were cut. And their main job was then trying to, and they did, ironically, East German diplomatic vehicles were used to smuggle a few high-profile Allende supporters, including an ex-foreign minister, in the boot of their car out of Chile into Argentina. And from there, they made their escape, which was such a curious parallel to the way people were being smuggled into West Berlin across the Berlin Wall. Yeah. in the boots of people's cars. And I think in German it's called Flucht von der Junta, von der Junta. But I can find that out and give you the information. Because one of the Chileans in East Germany then became president, and indeed she was already, it was before she became president, but she was already influential in her party, which is why the Chilean government agreed the first post-Pinochet and left-of-center democratically elected government in Chile, which was a wide coalition, including former communists, as gratitude for what East Germany did for those fleeing from Allende. They were happy to give the Honeckers refuge, quite apart from the fact that Sonia, the daughter, had married a Chilean, one of those who was in exile in East Germany and had moved to Chile. So there were family reasons as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Mark Brains commented around the possible use of force by the East German government, saying, I think you're right. He would have ordered the use of force. And Mark says, thinking also about Tiananmen Square, which was just a few months earlier. I think that was June 89.
That's right. Mark, that's a very good point. And of course, famously after Tiananmen Square, all the East German official pronouncements were totally behind the Chinese government. And Egon Krenz, who of course succeeded Honecker immediately, was sent off very short notice to Beijing to give, messages of brotherly, fraternal, socialist solidarity in person. So absolutely, yeah. And of course, the fact without Honecker that there was no use of force, again, there's an element there, probably a bit like the reading out of the new travel ordinance, which collapsed the wall in short order a few hours later. No doubt there were lots of messages and just that got lost in the chaos. And just as if you talk to the or you see the interviews with the leading Stasi people on duty on the wall on the night, they eventually opened the wall under great pressure. I think Bornholmer Strasse opened first. I forget the head of the Harald somebody. I forget the surname of the Stasi officer on duty.
Harold
he couldn't
Jaeger.
get an answer. Couldn't get an answer out of his bosses. And in terms of the use of force in Leipzig and so on, I think it's just as likely that the senior Stasi officers couldn't get an answer from Berlin, and they certainly wouldn't have used force without positive orders to do so. So this sort of situation produces a vacuum, and a vacuum produces paralysis amongst the more junior decision makers, particularly in a system, a mixture of kind of Marxism and GDR Prussian discipline. If the chain of command breaks down, more junior people haven't got a clue what to do and are paralyzed. They don't know what to do because they haven't received any orders.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, when you look at Bornholmer Strasse, I think, it was almost like safety concerns in the end because of the pressure of the crowd on that
Yeah.
crossing point that opened the gates there. A real and existing example of people power, I think,
Well, safety
John.
concerns, but not in your kind of health and safety officer in,
Yeah.
my local council, but
Yeah.
perhaps the Stasi officers there, the border. Well, all of the Grenzsoldaten were under the Stasi, right? Not under the
Mm.
interior minister, effectively. Perhaps they feared for their personal safety as these people got more and more angry as the hours went past between hearing this announcement on TV and not being allowed to cross.
Yeah. 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 If anybody wants to ask a question, please do use the chat. You're running out of time now for asking questions. We're into our last 10, 15 minutes. A question that I had for you, John, was did Margot talk about their time in Moscow when they were flown out of Germany to Moscow? And I think that was where Erich was diagnosed with the
Yeah,
liver cancer as well.
yeah. I got the impression he was actually diagnosed quite a long time before that with
Mm.
serious health problems. Um, and of course, in typical Soviet, pre-Gorbachev Soviet fashion, you know, he probably had a cold or something, and nothing was revealed to the public. Um, I think when they went to Moscow afterwards, this was again. I apologize for repeating the main theme, but this all came back to that wasn't the Soviet Union they knew and loved. That was this kind of semi bastardized Marxist light version that Gorbachev had produced. So I think they'd fallen out of love with the place. I think that was the impression she gave me, because she would wax lyrical about the Soviets and fraternal relations earlier, but she didn't have anything good to say about the Gorbachev era or thereafter.
No, no, because I think they took refuge in the Chilean embassy for about a year in Moscow.
Yeah, obviously, as I put in my article, they weren't swimming in offers of a new home, and they were facing criminal proceedings in Germany. The Soviet Union had not yet ceased to exist at that point, but was clearly on a path to um, either ceasing to exist or changing its system radically. And there was really nowhere else they could go. It was probably a slice of luck for them that Sonia had married um, a, a, a Chilean refugee back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So has anybody got any other questions? I've almost come to the end of mine, I think. Is there anything we've not covered, John, that you think is worthwhile mentioning tonight?
Yeah, I as I put in the article, the famous concept from Hannah Arendt of the banality of evil, which links back to they're looking like somebody's grandparents, shrunken and inoffensive, um, and that was the big lesson I came away with. Obviously, in my career, I've met other people who've done terrible things in their past, um, but and reinforced, of course, by her refusal to countenance that they'd ever done anything wrong, despite having at that point 20 years, over 20 years. I mean, we're talking 2011, 12, 13,
Hmm.
that period. So over 20 years to ponder it and to see nothing wrong in the ideology and the dogma. Um, and indeed, she thought East Germany was a very honourable uh, um, attempt, to implement Marxism, and she was clearly full of nostalgia for it.
Mm. Yeah, we've got a couple of last questions here. John is asking, how was their life in Chile? Was it comparable to their prior life in terms of their living accommodation and how they were living? I think you've already said that, Margot was relatively isolated in so much that she couldn't speak
Mm.
Spanish. But
Yeah, and obviously Erich Honecker couldn't, and they were only there. He was only alive in Chile for, as I said, a year and a half maximum, less maybe, 15 months. Um, so the house was nice, but it was kind of, I don't know, lower middle class type, present enough house, but quite small, a little garden, residential area, and it didn't look. I only ever went there once for this dinner that I've described. It looked fine, but not luxurious by any means. It was a family home, and um, but it's hard to. It's quite intriguing question because on the face of it, it sounds like they lived in a lot less luxury. But then, of course, with €1,000 a month, she could probably, in a strange way, buy more if she'd wanted to, nicer food and more luxuries than they could at times, even as when they were running East Germany. So it's an intriguing question, but a very quite a simple and withdrawn life. And she never travelled and never renewed the passport. I think Sonia told me she was allowed to continue traveling on the East German diplomatic passport she had up until arriving in Chile. I don't think she ever went to the United German Embassy in Chile to get a new passport or ever traveled anywhere again in those last, what would it have been, nearly 25 years of her life, right?
yeah, I seem to think she went to Cuba or somewhere to receive
Maybe,
some award from Daniel Ortega or
possibly,
something.
in which case she would have been allowed to travel on an old East German passport, presumably.
Yeah, yeah,
If it
yeah.
was
You can.
still in date,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
they would. She did mention Cuba. You might be right. You might be right, but she
Mhm.
definitely lived what anyone now would call a hermit type life.
Yeah. I can just imagine their faces at the German embassy where she turned up at the door
Well,
asking for a passport.
exactly. But presumably there was someone in the pensions administration in United Germany who had
Mm.
the same sentiments, authorizing €1,000 a month.
Yeah, might have been one of those long-term Stasi sleeper agents in
Yeah.
the pensions agency. Who knows? Who knows? One last question from Mark Brain. Do you still how do you still keep your German going, John?
Um, Obviously, it's not as good as it once was, um, and not least because I've learned other languages since. Spanish is our first language at home, uh, but I read quite a lot. I've got my own collection of books, similar to yours behind you in German, include about the GDR, about the Nazi era. I've just watched Der gleiche Himmel, which you reminded me of, Ian, when we spoke about the
Mm.
Romeo agent.
Yeah.
I'm sad they never made a second series of that. I think
It's
it,
a real shame. It's a
yeah,
tragedy. It
maybe
really
COVID
is.
came in between, but it did lend itself to, because the story didn't finish naturally
Yeah.
at the end of it. Um, but so I watch in German. Um, so it's not as good as it once was,
Mm.
but it's definitely still there because I learned it in my teens and in my formative years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for coming on. Thank
No,
you to
thank you for inviting me.
everybody. Well, not a problem. It's always a pleasure to hear from somebody who's got that, that first-hand insight of meeting somebody as fascinating as Margot Honecker. Thank you, Mark, for correcting my pronunciation. If you'd like to hear, see, listen to more of Cold War Conversations, just go to coldwarconversations.com. It's all there. But thank you for everyone that joined tonight. Right, I've just ended the stream. We had about 88 people.